Grace and peace to you from the one who was and is to come. Amen. Let there be light. I'm fond of the creation story in the first chapter of the book of Genesis. We're taken into a garden where human beings are allowed to be just human. There are no nations, no parties, and no religions to set people apart from each other. They're just human beings in the midst of a creation that is praised as being very good. There is no room for conflict and division. No one lives at the expense of someone else's life. Everyone is considered to be equal. Is it a vision of a glorious past or rather of a hoped-for future? This vision of equality is also what I appreciate about the age of the Enlightenment and its quest to understand more deeply what makes a human being human and humane for the sake of a more peaceful world. To become more enlightened also meant to be critical of a church that claimed to have a monopoly on the truth and expected blind submission and obedience. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose 300th birthday is being celebrated this year, was one of the key figures of the age of the Enlightenment, encouraging people to make use of their capacity to reason, probe, and question. Human beings were finally to grow up, assume responsibility, and liberate themselves from their self-imposed ignorance and immaturity. Don't just believe what others ask you to believe. Think for yourself, know the facts, and don't allow those in power to intimidate and mislead you. What does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to be humane? Can we not agree on something that binds us together across nations, parties, cultures, and religions? In his talk on Immanuel Kant's contribution to the age of the Enlightenment, the theologian and author Christoph Stürmer highlights a few biblical passages that speak to Kant's call to liberate ourselves from self-imposed ignorance and immaturity in order to pursue the idea of a universal humanism. It is the still unfulfilled promise of being able to see and respect the fellow human being in everyone we encounter. Indeed, how are we to redefine our relationship to the other than human in our present earth crisis if we cannot even see the brother and sister in every other human being? And was Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom of God not also driven by such a vision of equality and a radical critique of the political and religious status quo of his own time? Immanuel Kant's definition of enlightenment is striking. Enlightenment is a human being's emergence from self-imposed immaturity. Have courage to use your own understanding. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why so great a proportion of human beings gladly remain in lifelong immaturity, and why it is so easy for others to establish themselves as their guardians. It is so comfortable to be immature. Kant's sentiment resonates with Bob Marley's redemption song. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Oh, some say it's just a part of it. We've got to fulfill the book. For both Immanuel Kant and Bob Marley, enlightenment or emancipation is about no longer remaining bystanders. It is about disobedience, the courage to think for oneself, the freedom to probe and question dominant scripts and speak out against structures and systems that silence and oppress. But how do you go about emancipating yourself or liberating yourself from self-imposed immaturity? Let there be light. According to Christoph Stürmer, we could go back to the Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden. From a psychological point of view, the story can be interpreted as a difficult process of human individuation and development. Eve is caught up in a conversation with the cunning serpent. She rejects the false claim that it is forbidden to eat from all the trees of the garden. God is said to have only forbidden the eating from the tree of knowledge at the center of the garden. But Eve clearly wants her eyes to be opened and know the difference between good and evil. And so she dares to taste the fruit and shares it with Adam. Both of them awaken from their childlike innocence and become adults. The story of Adam and Eve is then no longer about a tragic mistake that condemns humanity, as traditional interpretations suggest. The story rather highlights the difficult but necessary step in the psychic growth of all human beings. Expelled from their childhood paradise, Adam and Eve achieve a new level of consciousness by rejecting an authoritarian religion in which blind obedience to divine authority is the cardinal human virtue. The scholar Stuart Charmé therefore suggests, at a deeper, more subversive level, the message of the story is to emphasize the painful necessity of breaking free from the security of a childhood that is governed by parental authorities and to assume the knowledge and responsibility necessary to determine one's own path in life. Such a psychologically informed reading suggests that the story is not really about disobedience to a divine commandment, but rather the fulfillment of human beings' mature spiritual capacity. Adam and Eve become an example of those committed to gaining knowledge, seeking enlightenment, and daring to leave behind the comfortable state of immaturity and ignorance. But they do pay a price for it. The Bible speaks of punishment and not of original sin. They lose their naivety and innocence, become aware of their mortality, and have to deal with all the experiences of alienation and separation that come with growing up. And with the knowledge of good and evil comes the burden and hardship of making the right choices and assuming responsibility for one's actions. Let there be light. If we think of our choices and actions as the ongoing attempt to create order out of chaos, then we can even think of God's very own intervention at the beginning of time as an expression of enlightenment. The first verses of the book of Genesis describe the earth as being tohu vabohu. This Hebrew phrase is usually translated with formless and empty. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber preferred to think of those two adjectives as describing the earth as being in a state of madness and confusion, which certainly resonates with our own present experiences of the world. Genesis then tells us that darkness was covering the primordial depths and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And then God is said to have addressed this diffuse state of madness and confusion by announcing, "Let there be light." And there was light, the text says. And thanks to this creative, divine impulse, the world continues to be ordered, becoming a place that nurtures life and growth and well-being. One can think of the sea not only as the primal example of enlightenment in our Bible, but also as an astounding achievement of a truly creative and inspired work of writing. Just consider the historical circumstances of this first biblical creation story. It is scholarly consensus that the first creation account belongs to a textual layer in the 5 books of Moses, which was written during and after Israel's exile in Babylon around the 6th century BCE. It was a time marked by catastrophic upheavals, Israel had to deal not only with the trauma of a lost war, but also with the terror of deportation. The political elite was exiled. Given the powerful influence of new and foreign gods and myths, Israel's religious and cultural identity must have been under threat. The mental and emotional state of those exiled could very well have been described as formless and empty. Madness and confusion, chaos and disorientation must have prevailed among those prisoners of war deported into exile. Let there be light. Israel's scribes and sages would not give up hope. Their version of creation came at the right time and was meant to bring light into the darkness, new orientation and order to the madness and confusion. Their story of creation was a form of proclamation, summoning those captured and exiled to emancipate themselves from mental slavery and liberate themselves from self-imposed ignorance and immaturity. There was an urgent need for enlightenment. Their God would prove to be the divine impulse needed to restore order to the madness and speak a word of clarity to the confusion. The scribes dared to challenge the Babylonian belief of the sky being populated by a host of gods. Yes, of course, given the limitations of their scientific knowledge, the earth was still a disk and the sky a fold. But the scribes were committed to declutter and secularize the heavens. Israel was not to think of sun, moon, and stars as deities. They were not to be intimidated and made small by what the Babylonians considered to be divine powers. Israel was to rather think of them simply as lights in the firmament. The sky was demythologized. But more importantly, the scribes dared to proclaim that all human beings are created in the image of God. Such God-given dignity of every human being was to be deeply engraved in Israel's collective memory. All are equal in the eyes of God. It was another aspect of enlightenment that remains of enormous relevance in our deeply polarized world, dominated and terrorized by an us and them thinking and rhetoric. Such proclamation of absolute equality based on an inherent dignity is even more astounding when we consider its historical circumstances. The scribes were writing for people whose national identity was at stake. Instead of pursuing what we now would call identity politics, they proclaimed a universal affirmation of absolute equality. Everyone's dignity was untouchable, independent of one's ethnicity, color of skin, religion, gender, or age. Everyone's dignity was considered sacred and given. And it was along those lines that the seventh day, the Sabbath, was envisioned to be more than a day of rest. It instilled the hope for an eternal Sabbath, a time when all would finally be able to enjoy the same measure of respect and rest, including the animals. What are we to make of this daring proclamation that every human being is created in the image of God? This must have certainly also applied to the Babylonians. What a bold testimony to a universal humanism which affirms everyone is being created in the image of God at a time when Israel found itself suffering humiliation and enslavement. The Jewish philosopher and Kant specialist Omri Boehm is convinced that only such a universal humanism will promise genuine peace in the world. He insists that everyone's politics have to begin with a firm commitment to the equality of all human beings. Such a universal humanism does not undermine people's different identities, but rather protects them. Without such a universal commitment to everyone's dignity and equality, identity politics will cancel and obliterate each other. We see this in all the violent conflicts around the world, where those opposing each other only see the enemy in the other, and therefore are not able to see the human being, the brother and sister, the son and daughter, the mother and father, the grandmother and grandfather. Indeed, let there be light. Let there be a new age of enlightenment. Let us more fully enter into the kingdom of God, inspired to liberate ourselves from what Kant called our self-imposed ignorance and immaturity. May it reignite our hope for universal humanism. From the very beginning, our Bible introduces us to a God whose creative impulse sets a process into motion that keeps responding to our experiences of madness and confusion. Thanks to Israel's scribes in their daring commitment to emancipate those exiled from their mental slavery, we are summoned to hold on to the ancient belief that everyone is created in the image of God and gifted with a unique dignity. And with Eve, we have an ancestor who did not want to remain naive and ignorant, but was willing to grow up, seeking to know the difference between good and evil, willing to assume responsibility for her choices and actions. We are in good company in our search for a more peaceful world, and we will see in the second part of the sermon how faith is not so much about obedience, but rather about disobedience, the need to resist the forces of madness and confusion and any form of authoritarian religion or politics. Let there be light. Omri Böhm credits Immanuel Kant with translating the biblical idea of equality into secular thought. The idea of humanity is formulated as a moral concept. What makes human beings human is not a natural property, but their freedom to commit themselves to follow moral laws. By formulating the idea of humanity as a moral concept, Kant not only translated the biblical concept of duty into secular thought, but he also modernized the idea of following a law that is not human-made, but given and non-negotiable. In other words, we are all created in the image of God. It is an inherent dignity that cannot be questioned or taken away from anyone. South Africa's constitution protects human dignity as both a value and a right. Human dignity as a value is found in Section 1 of the Constitution, where it states, "The Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values: A. Human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedom." But human dignity is also enshrined as a right in Section 10 of South Africa's Constitution, where we read that everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected. But if the Constitution refers to dignity as being inherent, then it is not a right granted by the state to its citizens, but rather something that characterizes a person simply by the virtue of being human. And it is such inherent dignity that is to inform society's vision of equality. So, let there be light. According to Christoph Stürmer, a universal humanism that affirms a person's inherent dignity comes not only with rights, but also with obligations or duties. To emancipate oneself from mental slavery and to use one's ability to think for oneself is one of those obligations. It is, of course, so much easier and more comfortable to outsource one's thinking to authority figures and choose blind obedience. The resurgence of autocratic regimes and people's willingness to submit to an authoritarian leader is worrying. Such submission can be motivated by the desire to be left alone and enjoy one's own private peace, But it can also be driven by the fear to lose one's societal status or one's living standards. The fear of war, of climate change, or the foreigner, the foreign other, can also make people choose the apparent safety of national egotism and the building of both emotional and even physical walls. Yes, we are all equal, but some are clearly more equal than others. One of the challenges for any liberal democracy, Christoph Stürmer argues, is to make sure that such affirmation of our inherent dignity and the promise of a universal humanism does not become an empty shell. Omri Böhm is concerned about the disappearance of the concept of duty and the predominance of the concepts of rights. While liberals are said to be quick to speak out for universal rights, the notion of universal duties or obligations is often underexposed. But the obligations and duties that come with our rights might also require from us to act against our own personal interests. Immanuel Kant was very clear that our civil rights also come with concrete duties. Society's high achievers and wealthy often insist on their civil rights in order to protect their privileges. And politicians are tempted to shy away from reminding people also of their duties. While South Africa's constitution, for example, protects the existing rights to property, property also comes with duties and is meant to serve a social function, addressing issues of fairness, equity, and justice. Equitable access to land, for example, is particularly relevant for those deprived of land due to past discriminatory practices. Let there be light. The question of what serves the common good has to play a more prominent role. This applies especially to our responsibility towards future generations. Lifestyle changes are not popular, but an important aspect of our duty and obligation to a more sustainable living. The need to emancipate ourselves from our mental slavery challenges the more comfortable mindset of remaining ignorant and immature. 2 examples. Millions of men, women, and children work in inhumane conditions as part of a global supply chains. They suffer mistreatment and are paid less than a living wage. Very often the pricing and deadline demands from companies of the global north exacerbate working conditions. Should transnational contractors, buyers, and retailers not be held responsible for the exploitation of workers? Do they not also have an inherent dignity? And what do we make of the fact that clothing manufacturers are producing more clothes than ever, apparently over 100 billion pieces per year? The rise of social media and online shopping in combination with fashion companies trying to keep up with ever-fasting evolving trends results in up to 40% of clothes per year not being sold. Such exorbitant waste requires radical changes in production and legislation. The other side of the coin is, of course, the question of overconsumption and the industry's carbon footprint. Addiction has many faces, but at whose cost are we indulging in such frightening waste? How would one start to promote the kind of solidarity that keeps an eye on the common good and the belief in everyone's inherent dignity? Immanuel Kant organized his ethics around the notion of a categorical imperative by raising 3 basic questions. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? According to Kant, we can only truly know the natural, observable world. In response to the question of what should I do, Kant developed a universal ethical principle which states that one should always respect the humanity in others, and that one should only act in accordance with rules that could hold for everyone. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Such a moral law is a truth based on reason, binding all rational creatures to the same moral law. And yet, Kant's ethical theory is said to require belief in free will, God, and the immortality of the soul. These three aspects cannot be known in the same way that we observe the world around us, but we can hope for them. And it is in reflecting on the obligation to follow the moral law within us that we are said to come to believe in what we cannot know but can truly hope for. Kant's categorical imperative resonates with Jesus' golden rule in the Sermon on the Mount. Always treat others as you would like them to treat you. That is the law and the prophets. The golden rule asks us to be empathetic and develop the ability to put ourselves into someone else's shoes and see the world from their point of view. What are required from us are empathy, courtesy, and the courage and willingness to take the first step. The golden rule comes towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Having encouraged his audience to trust God's faithful and loving commitment to this world in our lives, Jesus sends them into everyday life with a very concrete and practical moral law. It is a phrase so condensed and succinct that it can easily be remembered. But it is also a phrase so broad and wide that it can build bridges and bridge the differences of our experiences and encompass all of our life stories. Its wisdom is present in many cultures and captures in different versions. It speaks not only to people of faith, but also to those who are just fascinated with human nature and keep asking, what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to be humane? It is called the Golden Rule because its wisdom is as resistant, constant, and noble as gold, but also because it is recognized as possibly the most essential currency of our lives together, protecting people's rights and inherent dignity. It reminds us of both our rights and our obligations, and is a key ingredient of emancipating ourselves and become enlightened. But for Kant, such enlightenment is not just a function of the brain, but also of the heart, a learning to see with the heart. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect upon them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. I see them before me and connect them immediately with the consciousness of my existence. Such seeing with the heart is not really part of our education system, but for Kant it is the starry sky that fills his heart with admiration and awe. It awakens the consciousness of his own existence, and by looking at the very starry sky, Kant does not just realize how small, but also how great he is. He's a human being who, when contemplating what is boundless and endless above him, also realizes that the moral law is awakened within him. The starry sky reminds us of another biblical scene from the book of Genesis. When Abraham begins to doubt his future, he is nudged by God to look up into the starry sky. Something resonates with him. He gains new confidence. Is it not also a moment of awakening, recognizing the moral law within him? For we know that shortly after this experience, Abraham is not afraid to challenge God's authority. While God is said to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness, Abraham is said to remain standing before God, despite having to deal with a lot of uncertainties regarding his own existence and future. Abraham has the vision and courage to challenge God's authority on an issue of justice. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing. to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? Let there be light. Where did Abraham, the father of the three monotheistic religions, learn such chutzpah? Was it by looking to the starry sky? Did his experience make him a universalist, feeling empathy and compassion for the plight of these two foreign cities? He feels the obligation to speak up for the innocent and vulnerable. To him, such resistance is a call of duty, and it does not make him submissive but disobedient. It is a profound moment of enlightenment, of growing up, of leaving behind innocence and immaturity, of emancipating himself from mental slavery. What makes a human being human and humane? It is thanks to Eve that we are shouldering the gift and burden of knowing good and evil. It is Abraham's courage to speak up for the innocent and vulnerable that should inform our emancipation. It is thanks to the scribes in Babylonian exile that we are called to see the inherent dignity in every human being. It is Jesus' golden rule that appeals to common reason and allows us to build bridges of empathy and understanding. And it is thanks to Immanuel Kant and Bob Marley that the call for universal humanism based on everyone's inherent dignity continues to be amplified beyond our own faith tradition. And it is thanks to God that an initial creative impulse summons us to grow up and respond to the madness and confusion we encounter in the world around us. And so, as you leave from here, God bless you and keep you with a faith and love as wide as the earth, as high as the stars, and as deep as the oceans. Amen.